now I'm going to have the pleasure of introducing Greg Eghigian, who I have known actually as a fellow German historian, even if he's not here in that guise today, for quite some time. Greg and I started our careers working in a broad realm of what we might call the social. That was really, in German terms, defined quite broadly and often very much defined by the state. So his early research has focused on the nature of power and the relationship between the state, science, and medicine in understanding and managing disability, deviance, criminality, mental illness, and security. He's written extensively about the ways in which scientific and medical institutions have understood and treated those deemed mad, abnormal, or delinquent. So his publications include, from 2017, the Routledge History of Madness and Mental Health. From 2015, the prize-winning book, The Corrigible and the Incorrigible, Science, Medicine, and the Convict in 20th Century Germany. And from 2010, a Rutgers University Press book on From Madness to Mental Health, Psychiatric Disorder and Its Treatment in Western Civilization. Leading up to his current work, Greg has published fun articles on things like making UFOs make sense, ufology, science, and the history of their mutual misunderstanding. Another article on on flying saucers, extraterrestrials, and America in post-war Germany. And then a particular favorite of mine, because studying psychopathology in Germany is kind of a thing, especially in post-war Germany. His article on a drifting concept for an unruly menace, a history of psychopathy in Germany. His current work and most recent work is now moving into studying the history of the supernatural and paranormal phenomenon. And he is writing a new global history of UFO sightings and claims of alien contact throughout the world that is under consideration or forthcoming with Oxford University Press. And that research has been funded by NASA, the American Historical Association, the American Philosophical Society, and the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum. So I welcome Greg back to Rice, and he's going to speak to us today on UFOs and alien contact in the shadow of deception. Greg.
First of all, thank Kathleen for that very nice introduction. And of course, I definitely want to also thank Jeff for his generous invitation to have me speak here today. Going first here, I feel a little bit like the opening band for a weekend music festival. You guys get the Beach Boys. You're really here to hear Janis Joplin and Jimi Hendrix, and knowing a few of you, probably the Grateful Dead, but you got me. So if you don't like the music, don't worry about it. There are more and better bands coming, okay? In any event, let me start things off. Yes, I am, in fact, and have written a book about the global history of the UFO phenomenon that is set to be published, not this year, but next year, hopefully on World UFO Day. And a couple of things to start with. I mean, the first thing that as I got involved in this project, I was really struck by how this history has been written in, I think, a really remarkably narrow way. That when people have talked about the UFO phenomenon, particularly when they talk about its history, basically the story is always talked about as a mystery. And the story of UFOs is generally presented in one of two ways. Either the mystery is magnified, the mysterious elements, they get enhanced, they get, let's be fair, at times embellished. The other story, the other plot line, is one in which it's divested of its mystery, right? The enigma gets explained. It's aliens, it's government, it's meteorological phenomena, right? Something like that. So instead, what I want to do today is to focus on what has gone into the making of the UFO phenomenon as part of human history, and namely to do it by looking at one thing, and that's deception, and to look at the role that deception has played in actually playing a kind of key role in shaping the UFO and alien contact phenomenon as it's become known over time. To start with, if we're talking about deception, we have to start with a figure, at least when we're talking about the Western world, and that is the devil, the arch deceiver, or as he was talked about in the Middle Ages, the father of lies, right? Since the late Middle Ages, Christian theology established not only this idea of the arch enemy to God's order, it made the devil the model for our understanding, for understanding deception as this key to sin and evil, basically through temptation. But not just temptation, subterfuge, confusion, the exploitation of vulnerabilities, things like that. And Protestants especially viewed the devil and of course his minions, the demons, as tempting and deceiving people's both really directly through planting wicked thoughts in their minds, but also from a distance through encouraging corrupt ways of thinking or behaving. So diabolical temptation has really framed our sense of deception as destructive, as corrosive, as corrupting in some way. Now, I am actually not the unique or the first person in considering deception and its role in the UFO phenomenon. There is, in fact, another figure who's done that very thing, who traveled this path well before I did. Namely, this is the Archives of the Impossible own Jacques Vallée, who was here last year. Right? And he did so in a couple of different books. First of all, Messengers of Deception in 1979, and then later Revelations in 1991. Now, what he did in these works was he expressed this kind of concern at the time that he had, that the philosophies of many people who were claiming to have had contact with aliens, that they were kind of replete with, let's put it bluntly, racist and totalitarian values. He was also worried that the US government was actively involved in sending observers on a wild goose chase of one kind or another, and that, as he put it, there was this kind of dangerous mythology that was collecting or assembling around alien visitation that bred, as he called it, and I'm quoting him here, new cults that would extinguish the light of reason and free inquiry and threaten to drive serious research into the quicksands of speculation. Now, I'm interested in thinking about deception here in a slightly different way than Vallée talked and thought about it here. So rather than being concerned about the ways in which deceit and deception are kind of a barrier, kind of hurdle to our understanding of the UFO phenomenon, what I want to do is, in fact, adopt a sort of a slightly different approach. I want to look at the ways in which deception has been an integral part of the ways in which UFOs and the UFO phenomena have been perceived, been studied, been talked about, these kinds of things. So that when we look at the ways in which deception has played various parts, as I'm going to chronicle here today, in the drama surrounding UFOs, where we'll see that the UFO phenomenon has ties to other histories, and we'll see how deception, and here I mean deception both real and imaginary, has contributed, how they both have contributed to making the UFO phenomenon something socially, politically, culturally unique and distinctive in history. In my view, to neatly sort of attempt to separate deception from the phenomenon is to then not to acknowledge and appreciate their entanglements that they've had with one another. Now, it's important to keep something in mind when I'm talking about this. And it's something I often say, I say it all the time, it's probably my biggest mantra, okay? And that is, UFOs don't make history. people make UFOs, make history. It's a simple, but I think extremely important distinction to keep in mind. Let me explain. We can talk about it by talking about what's often considered the core element of the UFO phenomenon, experiences of witnesses, right? It begins with these very personal experiences. And an experience, by the way, it can be something remarkable, right? Like a meeting with numerous aliens who take somebody into their aircraft and actually maybe transport them to another planet where they learn their folk ways. Or it can be as simple as some technician reading his instrument panel, right? So an experience comes in many different forms, right? So we often talk about there's these sightings, right? These witnessings that take place. But the thing that I think is often neglected is that that's not what we tend to, most of us, traffic in. What happens is that some of these sighting experiences are then translated and transformed into writing. That is to say, we know that most people who have a sighting do not report it to anyone, or if they report it to somebody, it's maybe just a friend or a family member. Most never get written down in some form. So only a fraction get reported. They get transformed into writing. The writing might be through the police, it might be the Air Force, it might be a UFO civilian group, it might be a UFO agency, it might be the media, right? So some are turned into reports. However, another small fraction occupy an even higher level or a unique level, and that is they become stories, right? A fraction of these get transformed into widely circulating stories that become really part of a canon, right? Most of the stories and reports and sightings along these lines, this latter group, very small number, they get revisited, they get represented, they get recycled, they get reinterpreted in this seemingly unending loop. How many times have we read and heard the story of Betty and Barney Hill, Roswell, Rendlesham Forest? Our appetite seems unceasing in this regard, right? And it's this repetition which is why people say UFO lore is the stuff of mythology. These are modern day myths, right? As the psychologist Carl Jung thought about them, right? The stories become part of wider sets of conversations here. So in my estimation, we can't just satisfy ourselves with studying the UFO phenomenon as such. The phenomena is inherently entangled in how we talk about it, how we write about it, how we listen about it. And to be fair, we ourselves here today, this weekend, and I myself, I'm part of that conversational ecosystem, if you will, right? And that's the important thing to keep in mind. So, how then has deception figured into these sightings and these reports and these stories and these studies that are the stuff of the UFO culture and the UFO world, right? So to do this, I'm going to focus on 5 figures or 5 characters, if you want, that have popped up in my mind time and again in the history of the phenomenon to play a really pivotal role in how events have unfolded. So to start with, masquerading UFOs. So following those revelations in December of 2017, that I'm sure many of you remember, about a secret Pentagon program that was involved in tracking UFO reports, along with, of course, that was followed then by Navy videos, followed then by eyewitness accounts from pilots about their experiences, right? Since then, US intelligence has wondered about what could be behind these things, right? What's behind these phenomenon? Are these real objects? By the way, the intelligence people say, yeah, they're real objects, but are they real? Are they computer glitches? Could they be the product of malware of some kind, right? Then, of course, the more recent shooting down of Chinese surveillance balloons has seemed to lend credence to the idea and the notion that the objects are in fact real. But alas, they are very terrestrial. They have a terrestrial explanation, right? They represent an espionage effort disguised as an innocuous scientific research project, right? In other words, basically, this is hostility masquerading as curiosity. And let's be clear here, this is not a new phenomenon. The US Air Force, we know, conducted and carried out the same kinds of charade in the 1950s and the 1960s, portraying, for instance, its 20-story high surveillance balloons over the Soviet Union as parts of what they called meteorological survey of the Northern Hemisphere, right? And these, of course, were sometimes mistaken for flying saucers, as they were called during the time. By the way, just as an aside, I'm going to admit something. I find that term UAP amazingly antiseptic and boring. God, I hate it. And I know, I get it. There's a reason why. It's supposed to be antiseptic, right? But I miss flying saucers. I really miss flying saucers. Anyway, so charade, disguise, they've even entered into SETI research. I came across this article, I thought this was really fascinating. This recent article discusses the possibility that not only might other civilizations be cloaking their presence to outsiders and outside observers by distorting their transit phenomenon, right? But that the authors here propose that we on Earth could do this, were we to want to hide or disguise ourselves from others observing us in the universe, right? I thought that was fascinating here. So this kind of, it has to be said, this kind of cloak and threat, at least, of dagger is not new. In the immediate aftermath of strange sightings in the summer of 1946 and then in 1947, for instance, intelligence communities and the media speculated on what was going on here, and they tended to turn to the superpowers as being responsible here, right? The belief was that these were objects that were the handiwork of basically militaries that were engaged in Cold War surveillance and testing of new technologies. But something else, I think, to pause on here. Something that I think often is really neglected in conversations about the backdrop to the interest in the flying saucer after World War II, and that is, namely, World War II. We talk a lot about the Cold War, but not a lot about World War II. And here was a war that really, truly was like no other. I mean, we can talk about just the scale of the casualties alone. Estimates are around 60 million lives lost, right? And that only scratches the surface in many ways. But especially relevant for the post-war flying saucer phenomenon was its relevance, okay? And its relevance was this extraordinary technological research and innovation that was conducted during the war. So you have things like the Nazi encryption device here, featured here, the Enigma machine. You have the deployment and development of rocket bombs like the V1 and the V2. And of course, you get these so-called, what were thought about at the time, miracle weapons. The most infamous being the atomic bomb, right? All this actually carried over into the post-war era and played out in the early speculation about flying saucers. And actually, there's a really interesting chapter that's often been neglected. Again, gets very little attention, I think, for a lot of aficionados of the UFO. Is that all across the world, between especially 1947 and 1952, you had a bunch of men, and they were men, coming forward claiming that they were the inventor of these flying discs. You have W.H. Ashland, an engineer, an English engineer living in Chile, Alcides Kopp in Brazil, Juan Bautista León and Julio Ruiz in Argentina. And most common, however, were stories by Germans and Italians who claimed to have helped design these things for either Hitler or Mussolini or both of them, right? You get Giuseppe Belluzzo, Rudolf Schriever, and I think probably the most outlandish was that man at the bottom right, Jakob Starzyszny. He's a German national who is being held in the federal prison in Brazil for espionage, who said that he knew the secrets to the flying saucer, and here was the deal: I will reveal it to you if you let me go, right? Very inventive, didn't work. It's interesting that media outlets at the time reported on these stories, and they did so, I have to say, fairly uncritically. They kind of accepted the stories that these people were telling here. And then the story started to be taken up by a small group of unreformed neo-Nazis and nationalists in West Germany, who circulated another version of this story that is still alive to this very day in a lot of neo-Nazi lore, namely that Hitler never died. Hitler lived after the war. He was assembling, he was headquartered, either usually it was in the Himalayas or in Antarctica with his trusted scientific advisors. Those of us who have done German history know I don't think Hitler had much patience for scientists, so that seemed a little far-fetched. But in any event, they were hidden there, and that what the flying saucers were is that they were actually reconnaissance vehicles in preparation for World War III. So that's one of the other arguments here. But really, in my mind, the key role in establishing this idea of alien visitors behind the flying saucer phenomenon were storytellers, in particular two storytellers, though one I think plays the most decisive role. And they both published books in 1950. Pulp writers Donald Keyhoe and Frank Scully. Keyhoe is really important because his book is the first one to come out, and his book is so popular that you can trace its impact throughout the world because it gets serialized in periodicals, in newspapers and magazines throughout the world. And so very quickly, everybody is aware of his arguments and theses here. And what they do is they set in motion two basic ideas that are come to dominate talk about UFOs. One, that the government knows and has knowledge that these are actually aliens and they're lying about it. Secondly, that a campaign needs to be started to get authorities to come clean and disclose what they know, right? This becomes critically important here. Frank Scully's comments in his Behind the Flying Saucers book, here I'll let you read, shows how this thinking was informed by the politics of the Cold War at the time. It's one of the really, I think, distinctive things about the UFO phenomenon as part of the wider, whatever you want to call it, supernatural, paranormal phenomenon of the 20th century, is that it has these very direct ties to governments, authority, security, the military. Stories about Bigfoot or Loch Ness, stories about ghosts don't tend to do that, right? So, and this is what's made it so easy, I think, for people studying and interested in UFOs to adopt the language of threat, and also it's what leads to a lot of people to get attracted to theories of conspiracy as well. So yes, the 20th century's intelligence and service, I mean, not service, but surveillance culture really did play a key role, a fundamental role in the shaping of how UFOs were understood, just as today's cold spy wars that are going on are playing a role today in our perceptions of what's going on. Now, what of course people have wanted to know is this. If flying saucers really are the work of extraterrestrials or some other kind of intelligence, who are they? What do they want? Why are they here? This man, Whitley Strieber, another of our looming presences here at the Archives of the Impossible, in many ways best exemplifies this quest to make sense of what are really seemingly unfathomable visitors. And is that opaqueness? Is that deliberate on their part? Right? Becomes a sort of question that gets raised. This quest, too, has its history. Even before contactees in the 1950s began to tell their pretty elaborate tales about stories about meeting and conversing with these other kinds of intelligences, these visitors who were here, people were mulling over this question. What are they up to? What do they want from us? And indeed, I think you can say ufology's role has been to offer really a forum for just this kind of speculation. And in many ways, I think that speculation was even more pronounced in some ways. Back when people believed all we have to work with are literally the nuts and bolts, these objects in the skies, and we don't even know if they have pilots. The speculation was even wilder. It's why I think the most fascinating period to read UFO literature is in that period from about 1947 to 1950 when nobody has a clue what's going on. And there aren't a lot of really big theories out there, right? So, why weren't there creators who were driving these things or piloting these things, revealing their purpose? How are we supposed to read these contraptions and the intent of their inventors, right? Well, what some started to do is they approached this problem quantitatively. So they start using UFO sightings as data points, One of the most influential figures in this regard in the 1950s and 60s was the Frenchman Aimé Michel, who thought, one of the things he was, of course, famous for is he thought he found a pattern in the flight patterns, in the patterns that showed that evidence of these objects actually moving in straight lines in their flight paths, right? Which seemed to, therefore, if that was the case, would be indicative of something being piloted, where there's an intention behind it here. By the 1970s, you get people like psychologist David Saunders, who are then already seeking to code sightings so that information could be entered, then analyzed using computers. And this, of course, this very kind of work still is going on today. In fact, it's the stuff of a lot of government and civilian analysis going on right now, is in fact this kind of quantification, this datification of the phenomenon, right? But some thought actually there's a lot more direct way to know what these folks wanted, what these entities wanted. And this gets us then to the contactees of the 1950s. Beginning in the early 1950s, we get a series of figures coming forward to claim to have had encounters with extraterrestrials, usually from our solar system, right? The contactees and their stories. And their stories really shared a familiar thread. I was walking along somewhere one day, typically many of them were out in the American Southwest. Boom, I encounter this figure or these figures, and they're from another planet. And what they tell me is Earth is in danger because of the threat of atomic warfare and atomic energy, and we're here to help you. We're here to save you from yourselves. But there's something really interesting here that's going on, is that if you really start to read this stuff and look at it closely, and I know there are folks here who've done just that, right? The intentions of the aliens, the philosophy of these entities is actually really far from clear. The contact details were surprisingly vague on details, and that was something that a lot of critics at the time bring up with these contactees. But even believers like Edgar Ziefers here from 1955, Flying Saucer über Südafrika. He was actually Carl Jung's favorite author. And I must say, if you know German, read this book. It's an absolutely fascinating analysis that at a time when, again, people were really looking for lots of answers and there weren't many to be had here. But Ziefers lays this out, I think, quite nicely as a sympathetic reader of the contactees. Now, of course, the contactees, they paint this picture of a benevolent space brothers and space sisters here to help humanity. Others actually start to get led down a very different path, and they start to speculate along more sinister lines. And a lot of this gets sparked by what were called at the time the rise of hostility incidents. That basically, right, encounters between humans and aliens that get talked about in which that encounter is not a very friendly one, but it seems to have some violence associated with it here. And this starts to draw the attention of a very small number of ufologists at the time, one of the most prominent being this woman here, Coral Lorenzen, in the late 1950s and mid-1960s, well before the heyday of the alien abduction phenomenon as we know it in the 80s, from the 80s and 90s. Coral Lorenzen was attempting to figure out the meaning behind what seemed to be a change in the behavior of the aliens, a change in the nature of these encounters that were taking place. And what she starts to suspect, along with some of her colleagues, is this is an impending invasion. We are about to be colonized. Now, there, of course, are going to be others who come along who are going to see in this kind of opaqueness encounters that are something really actually quite different, something, of course, transcendent, something, I guess, ineffable, sacred, I think you'd have to say. And here in this regard, I think we can turn to the newest luminary whose papers have found their way here to the archives of the impossible John Mack. And in this, Mack shared a somewhat, I think, similar outlook to the contactees a generation before him, but he brought another dimension to the subject, namely the perspective of a therapist. It has to be said, Mack was certainly not the first to do this. Psychologist Leo Sprinkle from Wyoming had been involved in this kind of work since at least the mid-1960s, maybe even earlier. I had the privilege of having conversations with Leo Sprinkle before he passed away, and he agreed that he and Mack really shared a similar point of view that was, in his view, deeply informed by the fact that both of them were practicing psychotherapists. And it's part of what he said separated them from, say, people like Bud Hopkins, who took a very different approach to things. But the thing I think that's interesting here is that when I look at this as a historian who's also done a lot of work in the history of psychiatry, one of the interesting things is psychiatrists and clinicians are often asked when his name is brought up, was like, what on earth was John Mack doing with those people? Why was he hanging out with those people? Why did he take them seriously? And I often say, you know, actually the more interesting question is to turn that around. Why were they hanging out with him? Right? Why did they seek him? The contactees of the 1950s never sought out a therapist, never sought out a psychiatrist, right? They never looked, I don't know of any of them who really made some really deliberate effort to do so. That may be the case, but that certainly wasn't the vast majority of them here. And I think the key lies in part to understand his specific kind of intervention in all of this, right? Mack's intervention was to assume the kind of guiding, caring character that was rooted in the language of trauma that gets very common to late 20th century psychotherapy. But yet he overlays this as well with this understanding and this appreciation for the spiritual dimensions of all of this, right? So his argument, as I always get a sense of it from his writings and his interviews, is, hey, you might be terrified, you may well have been victimized, but you're going to come out of this, and you're going to come out of this fundamentally changed, and you're going to come out of this fundamentally changed for the better. And I think that message resonated with a lot of people. The next group, the misleading leaders. So, the UFO phenomenon has been replete, I suppose is the nice term for it, with intermediaries who have made it their job to interpret the evidence and to explain its significance to people, right? These are people who either were selected to do so, or they appointed themselves to be spokespeople. Sometimes they speak for institutions, sometimes they speak for organizations, sometimes they speak for witnesses, sometimes they just speak for themselves, right? Some, I think, have absolutely been well-meaning, others seemingly less so. But I think it has to be made clear and acknowledged that both observers within and outside the UFO world and the ufology world have raised questions about their status as sages of the impossible here. One reason for people to wonder whether the leading voices in the UFO world at any given time were actually operating in good faith has been the fact that some people have found in the phenomenon a way to make money or to become famous or to get a little of both, right? UFOs have offered up a way, an opportunity for commercial success for some people. We might call these the paratainers. I'm here riffing on Jason Caldwell's term of paratainment, right? The paratainers. We are, of course, familiar with cable TV shows that turn UFO hunting and investigation into adventure stories. They make their stars celebrities of some kind, right? There's, of course, little incentive in these cases to rigorously dig deep. This is, after all, entertainment, and it's supposed to be entertaining in that regard. But this idea of turning the UFO into a money-making enterprise is also hardly new. UFOs were commercialized from the get-go, right from the start. Pulp magazines, movies, TVs, best-selling books, toys. One of my favorite there on the upper right, that's Fred Morrison, the inventor of what he called the flying saucer, or he liked to call the Pluto platter. The Whammo Corporation takes it up. It gets, I think, it first gets distributed manufactured in 1948. Whammo takes it up and turns it into, of course, the Frisbee. That becomes the name for it. But I like Pluto platter much better. And with this, of course, with this commercialization have come promoters and self-promoters. And over the 75-year plus history of the flying saucer era, their involvement has followed a consistent pattern. It's really quite remarkable, right? The appearance on the scene of a self-appointed expert. Sometimes they've got appropriate credentials, sometimes they don't. The expert assumes the role of being a heroic whistleblower. They call out the authorities. The authorities are usually the government and/or academia. They call them out on their silence and their dismissive attitudes towards the subject. The expert announces now that what they need is a campaign to expose the truth. They turn their message directly to target the general public through the use of mass media. At first it was print media and radio, then it's TV and, of course, social media today. But here's the thing, their role as an expert hinges on constantly keeping the campaign going. The campaign never can stop, otherwise you lose your status, right, in that regard. And it has to be said, it's not simply debunkers who have raised questions about these people's authority and their status as spokespeople, right? People within the UFO world have, in fact, often voiced the common law doctrine of caveat emptor, right? Let the buyer beware. So it's a phenomenon that has, again, this question about authority that runs like a red streak through the history of the UFO phenomenon. Yes, this gets us to another figure of deception in the history of the UFO and alien contact phenomenon, namely the Joker. The Joker. You know, I gotta say, this is arguably the least studied and in many ways the most often dismissed figure of all in the history of the UFO phenomenon I'm discussing, right? And more often than not, jokers have been basically exiled to the realm of funny or irritating people and anecdotes, right? This is the world of the hoaxers, the pranksters, the con artists, and a lot of times the marketers, right? Witnesses and believers in alien encounters have consistently, right, complained of not being taken seriously. But you have to say, these gagsters, these farceurs out there, they've rarely been taken seriously. And of course, you might remind me, of course, that's the whole point. We don't want to be taken seriously. Fair enough, right? But probably the most well-known exception, however, has been the writer George Hansen. You know, his book, The Trickster and the Paranormal here, has become something of a canonical classic, right, in paranormal studies. But let's be fair, Hansen is hardly alone. There's a lot of scholars, a lot of academics who studied this widespread persona in the world of folklore, the trickster, this figure of a shrewd deceiver, this player of tricks who transgresses taboos, who topples conventions, who could just as easily be a con artist as a prophet, right? That kind of thing. I think there's something really important here, right? What I think the Jokers expose is another really widely neglected aspect of the UFO and alien contact phenomena, namely that this stuff is fun. It's fun to think about. It's fun to read about. It's fun to talk about, argue about. It is a lot of fun. I do not know how many times, you've experienced this, I'm sure yourself. You get to talking about this with people and what happens? They break out in smiles. They have stories to tell. Some of them are funny, some are not sometimes. But no matter what, people often really get excited to talk about this stuff because it's enjoyable in some fashion here, right? And I think that's something we have to recognize is nothing new. We know, for instance, from the history of the 19th century phenomenon of spiritualism, that many people went to spiritualist seances and things like that out of a desire to simply have some fun. They didn't take it terribly seriously, right? They weren't there to maybe make trouble. They were just there to have some fun. And of course, one part of this fun has been hoaxing and pranking. Hoaxers and pranksters, they've been a part of the landscape of paranormal culture for a very long time. Take, for instance, the practice of putting on a white sheet to scare people to think you are a ghost. This has a very long tradition. One of the earliest references to it date in English language, at least go back to 1584. In England, this was done for a lot of different reasons. A very common place for this was in churchyards and cemeteries, and it could have some very bad consequences for the person pranking because we know several people were beaten so badly they had to be taken to the hospital in the process. But of course, hoaxing has been a big part of things like the Bigfoot phenomenon as well. And there you see, of course, Harry Houdini in the upper left-hand corner, who was interested in this phenomenon as well. But of course, right, hoaxes, forgeries, frauds, they've been a staple of the UFO phenomenon since the earliest days in 1947. The motivations of perpetrators, well, they're pretty diverse, like the people themselves behind them, right? Some will go on to claim, we did it, and I did it for a laugh. It was fun. It was just fun to do. Other people do it for attention. Some tried to con people out of their money. Others do it out of a desire to educate people. That's what's going there on the bottom right. Two gentlemen who released a balloon in 2009 with a flare. They said to, quote, show everyone how unreliable eyewitness accounts are along with investigators of UFOs. So sometimes it has this sort of moralizing pedagogical purpose to it here. Pranking, it has to be acknowledged, has also been exploited for commercial purposes. Very soon after the reports of flying saucers, advertisers saw this as a great opportunity, right? So they turned to publicity stunts. The term for this is, they used alternating terms for it, ballyhoo or stunt marketing, right? But the idea is, right, you read something like flying saucers over Chicago, and then you find out it's because this new auto paint is so shiny it reflects into the air, and that's the reason why. And the idea here is the deception is a joke. It's the hook. It's the clickbait, right, in a non-digital world that gets you to look at the ad more carefully here. So the idea is you're not made out to be the fool in this. Instead, you're invited to laugh along with the advertisers here. So here, the art of deception is an innocuous little thing, or at least it's perceived to be as such. All right, the last one. If we aren't being fooled by technology, if we're not being fooled by aliens, if we're not being deceived by other people, there's been one other possibility that people have laid out. We're fooling ourselves, right? We're fooling ourselves. Homo deluser. It is we who delude ourselves. We may do this because we're ignorant. Maybe we do it because we're arrogant. Maybe we do it because we lack the facility to be self-critical. Maybe we are the emperor with no clothes, and the only people we listen to are that small circle of lackeys around us. Maybe we're to be blamed for all of this, becomes one of the other arguments that gets thrown around. Now, of course, one of the most, I think it has to be acknowledged, most insidious forms of this kind of sense of self-deceit historically has been associated with what for a long time in the Western world was referred to as madness, and we today would call mental illness. And also folly, another term that also a little more expansive than those two terms. But idea are these states of mind where our body, our soul, our mind can no longer be relied on in some ways as a reliable guide. And it has to be acknowledged, too, that in the 19th and early 20th centuries, there was a name for this state of consciousness. A person was said to be alienated from reason, right? That term alien shows up. And a specialist assigned to treat this kind of insanity was frequently referred to as an alienist. An alienist. This history of the UFO phenomenon has in fact intersected in multiple ways with the history of madness at multiple points. Probably one of the most widespread ways this has played out has been seen in the ways in which the mental health of witnesses and claimants have been routinely questioned by people. In common everyday parlance in life, right? This sentiment has been expressed by skeptics who use pejorative labels like crazy, screwball, crackpot. These, of course, have always been meant only one way, as insults on the credibility of people having experiences or having certain beliefs. But it also has to be said that beginning in the 1950s, there were certain professional clinicians who wondered whether there was a genuine medical pathology at work in all of these claims of witnesses here. The French psychiatrist Georges Hoyer was probably the first among the people to talk about there being what he called a flying saucer psychosis. He was followed in the 1960s by the New York-based psychiatrist Joost Meerloo, who spoke of what he called a flying saucer syndrome that he believed could affect some people who suffered from severe anxiety. But it has to be said, before we start to say, this kind of stuff, this appeal to psychiatry and mental disorder is only solely the preserve of outsiders who are seeking to discredit witnesses and experiencers, we need to keep in mind that during the height of the discussion about alien abduction in the 80s and 90s, investigators of all kinds embraced psychopathological reasoning to validate the claims of experiencers, or abductees as most of them were called back then. And they did so by pointing to the mental trauma that they appeared to manifest. So here you were with people who had extraordinary stories, harrowing stories to tell. You don't have photographs. You don't have artifacts to point to. You have memories and stories, that's all. So the question is, how do I validate that? I validate it, the argument becomes, through the presence of trauma. These people suffer from trauma. It lends credence to their stories here. It's not at all a coincidence that all of this takes shape following, in 1980, the publication of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, in which for the first time there's official recognition of what? The post-traumatic stress disorder diagnosis in 1980, which we know historically had an effect on expanding the concept of trauma. The UFO phenomenon is not unique in this, by the way. This happens in a lot of other related fields and other fields here. A lot of academic scientists remained pretty unimpressed. They increasingly spoke out to remind other people that these subjective reflections here, they might be heartfelt, but they're not a reliable guide to the truth in some way. A good example here from 1968. So Alan Hynek and James McDonald were very vocal around this time in saying UFOs merited scientific study. And the physicist Louis Branscombe publishes in, I think it's Science, I want to say, publishes this in 1968. Quote, this is his quote here: "The public does not understand the lessons learned by centuries of hard experience that the mental discriminator for distinguishing evidence from mystery and truth from falsehood must be set at a level above the random noise of experience." You can imagine a lot of people disagree with that, right? But that, to me, it reveals a lot about that mentality, particularly of the natural scientific community at that time here. And in fact, from around 1970 onward, this becomes really the common refrain of experimental psychologists, right? They had had now decades of experiences studying conformity, obedience, bias, peer pressure for decades. And so what they come to see is they don't see evidence in these stories and these witnessings that are coming out. They don't see evidence of extraterrestrial visitors, but they also don't see psychopathology at work. Instead, what they see going on are examples of nothing more than our inherent psychological shortcomings as human beings, something that affects all of us here. So by the time the media attention toward the alien abduction phenomenon had reached this crescendo in the 1990s, the people who are really raising questions about John Mack, Bud Hopkins, David Jacobs, and people like that who are involved in working with experiencers was not psychiatrists, it's psychologists, it's experimental psychologists. And to them, the idea is that these abductees were not victims of alien invaders, but actually of powerful, really altogether pretty mundane mental and interpersonal influences that could affect any one of us at any time. Okay, so to conclude my reflections here, what are we to make of this presence of deception in all of this history here? So as I pointed out, as a problem, the UFO phenomenon has been historically posed basically as a big question mark. It's a mystery, it's an enigma, it's a puzzle of some kind. So that tells us really that what it's been about from the beginning is it asks questions about knowledge, about how can we gain knowledge, how can we assess knowledge, how reliable is our knowledge. This is the reason why I think deception is one of those things that has both anchored its history, but it's also haunted its history, you have to say, over time. And it shows, this deception shows that the UFO phenomenon, I think like a lot of other impossible phenomenon, it's not just about arriving at some kind of truth, but rather what it has historically done is forced us to consider things like the weight we put on personal beliefs. And also it's helped us or forced us to question how much we trust not just others, but how much we trust ourselves. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.